Welcome to the Wellbeing Room. Today, I am delighted to have Mikki Brammer here as our guest. Mikki is an Australian writer and journalist, originally from Tasmania. She is now based in New York City, having arrived there via time spent working in France and Spain. As a journalist, Mikki writes about architecture, art, and design for a variety of well-known publications. During COVID lockdown, in her apartment in New York City, she penned her first novel, The Collected Regrets of Clover, which was published in 2023. It's this book and the topics that it explores that have brought her to us today. So welcome, Mikki. Welcome to the Wellbeing Room.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, lovely. So firstly, congratulations on the novel. It's a wonderful book and I really loved reading it. I actually read your book when I was traveling last year on a flight to Germany, and it really helped make that long haul flight a bit more interesting.
Oh, thank you. That's good to know. I'm glad it helped you pass the time.
Totally. I just devoured it. So the collected regrets of Clover, in a nutshell, and this is sort of my synopsis of it, it's about death and our culture's way of dealing with, or complete avoidance of dealing with that inevitability. Your main character, Clover, is a death doula, and she lives a fairly reclusive life for various reasons. She's had a fascination with death for a long time, and we learn through the book where that began and how the death of her loved ones has impacted her and led her to do the work that she does. Clover's story is not overly depressing or confrontational. There's quite a lot of joy actually in the story, I find, and it explores the experience of grief and loss through a lens of empathy and compassion, which is beautiful. So the discussion around death and dying is a topic we know that is feared in our Western society. However, I really believe there's a shift towards embracing more openness around the finality of life and what that means for each of us, especially as that's something, we all face inevitably. And I hope that's something we can talk about today in the Wellbeing Room.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. That was a great summary.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome. Yeah. So to get us started, I'd love for you to share with our audience how you gave birth to this idea for your book and what led you to explore the topic of death.
Yeah. So as most people would know, living in Australia, it's not really, death isn't something that we talk about openly there. And in my family, there were quite a few deaths early on of, great aunts and uncles and things like that. So it was something that was very present early on in my childhood. But because we didn't talk about it that much, I think it actually came from the fact that a lot of my family are in the health profession, doctors and nurses. So to them, it was quite a normal thing.
Yeah.
But for me, it wasn't, but I didn't really talk about it. And then that kind of compounded into what became a fear of death, essentially. And that was something that I carried into adulthood. And basically avoided talking about death, reading anything about death, thinking about death. It was just, I avoided it at all costs. And then I got to my 30s, I was living here in New York, and I thought, well, with everything else I'm scared of, I make myself do it until I'm not scared of it. So what if instead of avoiding death, I got curious about it and tried to understand where this fear came from? So being in New York City, it's a very easy place to go down any kind of rabbit hole. So I started just attending, talks by hospice doctors. I went to lectures on Stoicism because the Stoics were very preoccupied with mortality. I discovered death cafes, which I didn't know existed. I started going to those and read articles, listened to podcasts, and in that research or immersion, as you might call it, I discovered the concept of a death doula, which I was just so fascinated by because I just couldn't believe that someone would choose their professional life to essentially being watching people die on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And then I got to thinking, what would lead someone to choose that path? And that's when the character of Clover popped into my head. And then I thought, well, what if I could write a book that encompassed all that I've learned about death and grief and mortality in this immersion, but presented it in a way that was joyful and uplifting and fun, so that for someone like me that would normally avoid that book, it was actually palatable. And so when I was writing it and I'd tell people what it was about, I'd say, oh, it's a joyful book about death. And I'd just get these strange looks. And I just kept having to say, no, trust me, I know what I'm doing. This is going to be, it's going to work. And then luckily the agents saw what I was trying to do, and then eventually the editors, and then it eventually got published, and it's been out here almost a year and has done really well, and it's connecting with a lot of people. So it was kind of a big swing to try that, but I feel like it was worth it in the end. And to sum all of that up, one of the reasons was because we don't talk about death in Western society as much as we should. I wanted to try and help contribute to that more open discussion that does seem to be happening, but slowly.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great way in for people as well. Like if people read this book and they're in a book club, for instance, that's automatically means they're going to be talking about that topic just through the book club experience. I'm not in a book club, but yeah, I mean, I think that's a great way for people to broach that topic. I'm really interested in the Death Cafe. I've heard about these. I haven't attended one, and I think I don't know how big they are in Australia yet, but I get from your experience and from your writing in the book that there's quite a few in the States. Can you tell us a bit about your experience at a Death Cafe, and what's that? Is it like what's in the book, or?
Yes, yeah. And there actually are quite a lot in Australia. I think in every city, every major city at least, and some others as well. I've had people let me know that, which is great. I didn't know they were in Australia either. But yeah, I was in the New York Public Library one summer day, and it was like one of those sweltering days, and I'd gone in for the air conditioning, and I saw this flyer that said a death cafe, and I thought, oh gosh, there's no way I could do that. But then I like, no, in the spirit of being curious, I'm gonna do it. And it's basically like a gathering of strangers. There's a moderator. It is essentially what happens in the book, but everybody's there for different reasons. Some people, they are there because they're grieving, but others are just curious about death. One guy was there because his apartment was haunted, which I'm not sure that was the right reason, but you don't have to have a valid reason. It's for everybody, so you can come, and then they just open up the discussion, and you say why you're there, you go around the circle. And so I said, I'm here because I have a fear of death, and I thought it might be good to talk about it. And it was really helpful because you could see so many people just discussing it really openly and calmly, like it was no big deal. And that actually did help me, I guess, help to normalize it in a way, and just see it as it wasn't a taboo topic. And so they hold them all over the city. I've been to a few different ones, but they essentially have the same setup. That one didn't have food and drink, but often they are over meals or drinks, which is how the concept started when it started in Switzerland.
No, that's a really great description of what a death cafe is. Yeah, I'd definitely be interested to go to one and just see what it's like. So I don't live in a major city, so it might take me a while to get to one, but I definitely want to see what it's all about. So obviously diving into this topic for you, I mean, you're a journalist, so you're used to doing lots of research, and that's probably something you really enjoy doing.
Yes,
because that's what you do. But I was just curious, diving into a topic that you have this fear and anxiety about. What was that journey like for you?
It was uncomfortable, but I think because that is kind of my way, as I mentioned, facing my fears, I'm able to work through that. If I'm afraid of heights, then I make myself, jump off the high diving board until I'm not afraid, kind of thing. And so it was definitely uncomfortable, but I think it also, the more I learned about it and the more I understood it and had the appreciation for it, and even learned where my fear came from, I think the easier it made it for me. So I could see it was such a positive thing, and I could see how learning to talk about these topics could be helpful to other people. And it's been so interesting when someone knows you've written about a book about death, i.e., you're comfortable talking about it, everybody will talk about it. And so my theory from this whole experiment is that we all just want to talk about it, but many of our cultures make it hard to, or it's kind of an unspoken taboo. And so I think it's great that there is this kind of death positivity movement that's coming. There's more podcasts that are discussing about it, like yours. There's books, TV shows, and kind of a lot of them with the humor. And I think that can only be great because we're all going to face it. So the earlier you start talking about it, it's never going to be easy, but it will be easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I guess I'm curious, you said you experienced deaths in the family when you were younger. Was there any sort of spirituality or religious beliefs when those things that were just like, was any of that discussed as well? Like, because obviously death is, the end of life, but and usually there's some sort of practices around that. And depending on how you grow up, like every religion is different. There's spiritual practices and beliefs around that. So I'm just curious, was there anything around that was shared with you when you were a child growing up and experiencing those things that happened?
Yeah, it was actually interesting when I was kind of delving into where my fear came from. One thing came up was the fact that I was raised agnostic.
Mm,
And so essentially, my parents said, we don't believe in God, but you can believe in whatever you like.
mm,
But that means I didn't really have a structure. I think for a lot of people, knowing there is that next place that religion tells them is a comfort in itself. Whereas
mm.
saying, I mean, it's very nice that I had the freedom to believe what I wanted, but I didn't really
Yeah,
know what my options were
yeah,
essentially.
yeah, yeah.
And I think not having that and just having this, there was a finality to it, especially, being in a family with doctors and nurses, and a lot of them have a
Mm,
very scientific view of the world. And so there's not much comfort in that
mm.
either when
Yeah,
you're a child. And so I realized that that was, I think, helped contribute to it because I just didn't have any kind of structure. It was just, I think the finality of it, as I
mm,
understood it, was one of the things that scared me the most. And I think in exploring it for myself and through this research and understanding other people's beliefs, not even necessarily in a religious sense, but perhaps a spiritual sense, the
mm,
idea of souls and reincarnation and things like that, which I know does occur in religions, but I think there are
mm.
also, you can believe that outside of a particular
Absolutely.
religious structure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I kind of liked that idea. There is a little bit of that in the book. I didn't want to kind of pin it to anything
Mm.
particularly spiritual, but that did bring me a lot of peace when I kind of thought, okay, well, this is what I believe. And it helped me process it a lot more.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for answering that question. Yeah. And I see where you're coming from. Yeah. I guess for me, having been brought up in a religious background, yeah, I felt death was something that happened. I don't really remember what my beliefs are about it now, but I've gone for a more spiritual outlook at
Mm,
present, like that, our body, our soul is energy, and we just sort of,
right.
that
Yeah,
energy leaves and moves on to something else, and it still
exactly. Yeah.
exists, but yeah, but
Hmm.
it's just not
Hmm.
in our physical shell anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Soul is having a human experience.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Hmm.
that's a really important, and that can bring comfort just knowing that. Uh,
Exactly. Yeah. That's
yeah.
kind of the conclusion I eventually came to on the long journey.
Yeah, well done. I mean, I think it's wonderful that you embrace things like that you want to explore things that make you uncomfortable. And I think that's a wonderful sign of, someone who loves growing and learning and yeah, really wants to live a full life. So good on you.
Thanks.
Um, so back to the book.
Hmm.
So Clover has her three journals: regrets,
Hmm.
advice, and confessions. And she records the final words of the people that she sits with as they die in these journals. And they're an important part of the story. So I was wondering, what inspired you to have Clover use these journals, and what purpose do they serve, do you think, for the book and the story, and just around life and death in general?
Now, when I was researching kind of the things people say at the end of their life, like often they fell into one of those three categories. Obviously, for the purpose of the book, I made it a bit tidier. They don't always, but as a general thing, you could probably fit them into advice, confessions, or regrets, because I think that naturally comes when you're looking back on a life.
Mm,
Those are the sorts of things that will naturally come up. I mean, if someone has dementia or delirium, sometimes it is just something nonsensical, which I do try to note in the book. But I thought, she approaches life from this very methodical way of noticing patterns and documenting things, which she got from her grandfather, who's a scientist himself. And so I thought that would be a nice way for her to
mm,
kind of document her process, but also use it as a way of processing the fact that she just keeps watching people die. Because
Mm.
as much as a lot of that is putting your own emotions aside so you can have space for the emotions of not only the person who's dying, but all of their loved ones that are there and very upset a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But I also wanted them to kind of illustrate, for her, they become quite a crutch because she uses them as inspiration for her own life and tells herself that she's doing it to honor the person. So if they have a piece of advice, trying to live by that, or if they have a regret, trying not to have that regret herself. But really, it's a way of her just avoiding examining her own life for
Yeah.
what she might regret at the end. Interestingly, I did note that there were a lot of confessions on deathbeds, which I thought was fascinating. And that
Mm.
I do mention it in the book, but one of the most common ones, well, I guess it's not really a confession, more that someone asks for a divorce on their
Yeah.
deathbed. And I thought that was so interesting that people just don't want to leave this earth burdened with this attachment. And I thought, wow, what a really interesting
Mm.
thing to be so common, that people,
Yeah.
even though they're leaving this earth, I think regardless of their belief, they'd say, I want to do this one thing.
So, yeah, no, so thank you for explaining about the notebooks and how your research fed into that. I think it is interesting that yeah, people on their deathbed have these sorts of looking back on their lives and thinking back on what they would have liked to have done, what they didn't do, or
Mm-hmm.
what they've learned and want to impart some lasting knowledge to someone, um, and yeah, and really help give advice to people, for the life that they still have left to live. And it's an interesting experience. I mean, my dad passed away in 2019, so I do remember, those last few days of him
Mm-hmm.
going through that experience. I guess my question I actually wanted to ask you is about the death doulas. Like, how many death doulas did you speak to as you were preparing to write this book or during the writing of this book? Was that something that, you actually spoke to people in these roles, or did you just use stuff that you'd read and heard people talk about?
No, I did speak to quite a few. Some of them, understandably, were kind of less reluctant to share experiences because they are such a personal thing to the people dying.
Mm.
I also spoke to hospice nurses, the members of my own family who are doctors and nurses, and their experiences with dying people. And then I did a few kind of webinars and online trainings for death doulas just to see what it
Okay.
entailed. And what I learned from it was that there are just so many different ways of being a death doula. It really varies depending on the person. Some do have more of a medical background, some do more of a clerical aspect of, getting all of the documents in order. And
Mm.
some are more experiential, which I would say Clover is. And so what I did was kind of gathering all of that. I thought, okay, well, if I were a death doula, which I never could be, but if I were, how would I approach it? And so I took all of those elements in and kind of made Clover that kind of death doula.
Yeah, beautiful. I also love that she had studied thanatology, and
Mm-hmm.
that might be a word that people don't know what it means. So, do you want to just quickly explain what thanatology is, and what your experience of exploring what that is and how you brought that into the book?
Yes, I didn't know what thanatology was until I wrote the book. And then I kind of looked into what a death doula would study, which not all of them even have a degree. But in Clover's case, she experienced death really young. It's not a spoiler to say that she watched her kindergarten teacher die while he was reading Peter Rabbit, because it happens on the first page. And then her parents die when she's very young and she's sent to live with her grandfather. So similarly, death was very present for her, but instead of being scared of it, she developed a fascination with
Mm.
it and kind of an obsession of understanding it. And that kind of went through her childhood. And so it was a natural progression for her to then want to study it um, in university, which a lot of thanatology basically is the study of death, but that can take many forms, the same as a business degree can take
Mm.
many forms. Often I think it's part of a sociology degree. But in her case, she studied death traditions throughout the world. That's
Mm.
where, before she became a death doula. But some people might study, I mean, there's just so many things they could study, different aspects of death, like it could be causes of death, it could be trends, it could be, longevity and things like that. It could be cultural things. So I think, and I think it's something that's expanding more and more as people become more open about death. So it's a fascinating thing for
Mm.
someone to study, but a lot of people do have degrees in thanatology, which I found so interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting area to study, and definitely puts you on death's doorstep, so to speak.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So what do you hope your readers will take from reading Clover's story, and why is that important to you?
I mean, there's many things. I kind of wove a lot of things in because I believe that as a reader, you take what you need and you leave what you don't.
Mm,
Same with nonfiction books. I read a lot of nonfiction and you don't have to like everything about a book. So I kind of wanted to layer it with lots of different things. So as I mentioned, there's the fear of death. I hope that for someone like me who had that fear, it does make it a little bit more comfortable and easier to consider and think about. And I've had a lot of people reach out saying that. For others, I mean, a recurring theme in the book is the fact that nobody thinks about their death until it's basically on their door.
mm,
And encouraging people, well, maybe you could start thinking about it now. What would you regret if tomorrow was your last day? Or what
mm,
would you have wished you've said? Or things like that. And then while you can't fix everything, there is action you can take so that you'll have fewer regrets on your deathbed. So really kind of making people realize they have the chance. It's not inevitable to have all these regrets. You
mm,
can make changes now. But also on the topic of regrets, I mean, it's in the title, but I also didn't want to present regret necessarily as a completely bad thing. I think regrets are important because that's how we grow. And I
mm,
think when they're not such a great thing is when you don't learn and grow from them. So obviously there's things that you'll always regret, hurting someone or something like that. And unfortunately that's just something you have to carry with you and try to make peace with. But there's other things that you can be like, okay, I regret doing that. For example, someone who doesn't look good with a fringe, they get a fringe and then they realize this doesn't suit me. I regret getting it, but now I know I don't look good with a fringe. I mean,
yeah.
that's a very benign example, but I think
Mm,
that's how you learn, trial and error, basically. And so I think, and that's the point of what one of the characters says to Clover towards the end, Leo, is, you're trying to stop yourself from having any regrets, but then you're not
mm,
actually living because you're not putting yourself out there. You're not letting your heart get broken because you've got to endure those things in order to get to the good things beyond it,
mm,
because that's what being human is and that's what living a life is. And if you try to avoid all pain, then it's a safe life, but it's probably not a very
mm.
fulfilling one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, yeah, not going to give you the joy that, we can experience, when we love, when we, really put ourselves out there. Um, yeah, no, that's a really good point. Thank you for sharing that. And I love all the characters in your book. I think they're really well written. I can really visualize them easily. Um, they feel really embodied, I guess, in their own unique ways. Like, yeah, so you've done a great job. I would highly recommend, if you haven't read this book out there, read it. And I just also, just on a note, because I've started writing my own book a few years ago, I'm quite halfway, and I've sort of had to shelve it because I just haven't got the time at the moment, or making the time. There's always time, but do you make it?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I just love the way you end your chapters. Like, it's so well. Like, you've just, there's this one sentence, and I noticed this a lot when I listened to it in the audiobook just
Oh,
recently.
yeah.
And that's the end of each chapter. It's just like you have this one sentence that ties it all up, and it's like it either resolves something or leaves you hanging, or it's like, and it's just like, it's just perfect. I was like, how does she do this? It's just amazing. So yeah, so I just want to say, and I think that's why was able to read it so just, straight out, pretty much almost one sitting, just because it flows so well. So you good writer, probably really good editors as well, I would expect, and really good
I think
feedback.
yeah, those last lines, some of them took a bit of work. I mean, some
Yeah.
of them were there from the first draft, but a lot of them you're kind of like, is this they are a tricky thing. But I did purposely do the short chapters, because I, as a reader, love short chapters because they really propel you through a book. And
Yeah.
I love that feeling of kind of just one more, just one more.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm reading, I just read a book, I finished it yesterday. It was actually a really good book, but there were only 5 chapters in the
Oh
entire
wow.
book.
Yeah.
And when it's like that, whereas by comparison, I think Clover has like 55 or something. But, you know, when you are about to go to bed and you're like, oh, I should go to sleep, but there's only 3 pages left. So you keep reading. And then sometimes you actually keep reading past that. Whereas if you see there's 20 pages left, you think, oh, no, I'll just stop here. So I love that. It's a subconscious thing for the reader, but I did that on purpose to kind of make it feel like it kept you moving, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And just going back to what you said just before about I guess the idea that, we have this one life and, the regrets and yeah, I just want to share about, this mortality motivation. I think that's something that if we're more aware of the fact that we are going to die and we don't avoid talking about it, we actually, I think there's a Buddhist teaching where they actually think about death every day, like it's a
Mm-hmm.
daily reminder, you will be dying at some point. And using that as motivation to do the things that you want to do, to make sure you don't have those regrets as your life progresses, because we can get stuck. We can
Mm.
find ourselves in situations where we're not growing, where we're unhappy. I have experience of this myself.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you take that step and you realize, death is inevitable, it's a finality of this physical, presence. So really just, embracing what it is you want to do, and I think we live in
Mm-hmm.
a lot of fear in our society about, can I actually do that thing that I really want to do? And so we're fearful of even trying it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about that as well?
Yeah, I think it definitely, I mean, I've always been quite a driven person, but I think part of that drive has been the fear of, well, I might not have much time left to do this.
Mm,
Now I think I have a more healthy relationship with that. But still, at the end of each day, I always look back and go, did I live this as well as I could? What have I not said to someone that I'd like to say to someone? What could I have tried harder at? What am I avoiding?
mm,
And so that helps a lot, just that reflection, not in a, obsessive way, but just kind of taking stock and
mm,
then changing gears accordingly. But I think the thing I gained most from it, what I also realized about where my fear came from wasn't just a fear of my own death, but fear of losing my loved ones, because my
mm,
mum actually lost her mum when she was 13 or 12. And that's something I'd always known ever since I can remember. And through my flawed childhood logic, I thought that meant I would lose my mum when I was 13. So you can kind of understand where
yeah.
that fear compounded. And my mum is still very alive and well. But once I kind of realized that part of this fear is, the fear of not only losing loved ones, but losing them without having said the things that I wanted to say, showing them how much I appreciated it and loved them. And so I thought, well, what a gift that I've realized this now while my mum is still here. And she lives in Tassie, but we Skype every week. And so a few
Yeah.
years ago, I said to her, would you mind if I recorded our Skype calls, which she was fine with that. And I said, and there's a new rule that we can ask each other anything about anything, you've always wanted to know. And she's very open and she was fine with that. So I did, I asked her all the
Yeah.
questions and approaching it in a way of her not being my mum, but being a human and
Yeah.
being a woman, and asking her about the experiences with her mum dying, with her divorce, raising
Mm,
2 kids alone, all of the tough parts. And I have that all recorded, and which is amazing. And when I was doing my research, I realized that one of the things, because grief is a very prominent theme in the book, one of the things that people miss most about their person is their voice. And you hear those stories of people obsessively listening to the one voicemail that they have left
yeah.
to hear that person's voice. And now I have, 3 years worth of my mum talking about what she's growing in the garden or the jumper she's knitting and stuff like that, which sounds really kind of boring now, but once she's
Mm,
gone, that's going to be so precious. So really being mindful of, do you have a recording of that person? Do you have a video of them? I have a video of her weaving because that's her most favorite thing to do, and
mm.
just we do so much digital communication now. So just making sure you keep the birthday cards. And I'm a minimalist, so I admit to throwing things out. But
Yeah.
now I'm like, okay, well, one day this is going to mean something, so I'm going to hold on to it. So I think
Yeah.
it really gave me that gift of foresight and grieving or preparing myself for what I know is going to happen. And again, as I said, it's never going to be easy, but it's going to make it easier because I know I've said all the things. I have it on recording that I've told my mom how much I appreciate her. So in the moments that I doubt it, it's there.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I'm actually feeling a bit teary as you're saying all that. Yeah, because that's something I really wish that I'd done before my dad died, was have some videos or even some audio. There was one video I took of him a couple of years before he died, but it's not very good quality and the discussion wasn't the best topic to sort of remember him by. So yeah, so I have a regret, I guess, about not having done that. And it's kind of a bit sad now because my mum she's in early stages of dementia. So yeah, trying to have those conversations is, I guess, a bit more challenging for me, especially like, yeah, I don't want to be reminded of her in that state, if you know
Right.
what I
Yeah.
mean. So,
Hmm.
but she does have moments of lucidity. So, I mean, still, which is good. Yeah, but yeah, getting around that, you know.
And I think that's a really common thing, unfortunately, because we
Mm.
don't kind of think of it until it happens, or you want to think that it's not going to happen to you. So
Yeah.
it's really tough. I think, I totally get what you're saying, and I'm sorry that that's happening for
No.
you. I think,
Yeah.
but it is, yeah, I'm I think the more we talk about it and share these things, the more people who have the chance to kind of learn. And that's another thing about regret. If someone else can learn from my regret,
Yeah.
that makes
Yeah.
it makes it less painful for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, yeah, exactly. The more we talk about it, the more we're aware of it. And yeah, I think encouraging people to, if they know their parents will die or their loved ones are going to pass away at some point. So
Mhm.
having those little mementos, whether that's, like a card or an audio or a video of them, to bring you that, bring them back to life in a way for a
Mhm.
moment so that you can just cherish their eternal presence, I think is a
Mhm.
wonderful thing to do. Yeah.
And also, I think, especially in society now, because everything moves so quickly, like with digital and everything is just so fast that it's so easy to always be thinking in the future. So even when we are experiencing beautiful moments with our family,
Mm.
our mind is on something else that we don't actually
Yeah.
savor them. And that's what I really tried to teach myself to do, when I'm having a great dinner with friends or with family and just sitting there and appreciating and going, wow, this is what an amazing thing. Kind of like taking that mental picture, which I think
Mm.
is something you still can do with a parent with dementia because they do have those few moments of lucidity and rather than kind of lamenting,
Yeah.
oh, I wish there were more, saying, wow, this is here.
Yeah.
And so I really try to do that. And I think that helps a lot with that because there's that bittersweetness that you get when
Mm.
I might not have this person for much longer. And it's
Yeah.
really hard to not kind of go down a sadness spiral with that, but kind of trying to reframe it to be like, well, how lucky I am to get this
Yeah.
moment it helps me.
Yeah, no, I totally relate to that. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And it's, yeah, spending those times with our loved ones when we can. And like you say, appreciating that moment. And that's something that, at the end of every night, I have my journal and
Mm,
I have my 3 journal prompts. And the first one is what's something I appreciated today or what's a
mm,
moment I appreciated today. And I was saying to myself just last night, it's like, I really don't think you appreciate things enough in the moment, like, because I was struggling
yeah.
to sort of think of something and I'm like, maybe that's something I think I need to work on. And even though I'm mindful of it, but during the actual day when it's happening, I'm not so mindful.
Mm,
So yeah, I think
yeah.
that point you just raised is like really important to be appreciative in the moment, not necessarily in reflection, but actually in that moment, being
Yeah,
appreciative.
kind of taking stock. It's like for me, it didn't come naturally. Like I really had
No.
to train myself to do it. And I think
Yeah.
that is just the way we live now because we're constantly just doing rather than
Mm.
being.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. And we're a human being, not a human doing. So
That's right.
awesome. I was going to ask you how your outlook on death has changed and how you have changed as a result of researching and writing this book. You've kind of covered a lot of that already, but is there anything else that you think you'd like to share about how you've changed or how your outlook on death has changed after Clover?
Yeah, I think we have covered a lot of it. I will say I don't have the fear of death anymore, which is, in that sense, the book is a success because that's what I basically set out to do, is to explore my fear of death. But I think it has really deepened my relationships for that one sole thing of me making sure I say what I want to say and make sure people know that I appreciate them.
Yeah.
And then that reciprocates because you are kind of opening this dialogue that then people will often reflect back at you, which has been really amazing. It's really deepened my relationship with my mom. I think it's gotten my whole family in a good place because we've talk about death and, final wishes and things like that. So we all kind of know what the other wants, because that's one of the hard things, especially when a death is unexpected. The people left behind kind of have to unravel all of these things. So I think that's been great. What else? I think just what's been most rewarding is how many people have connected with the book and talked about how it's really changed their life, which still blows my mind that, that can happen. You can write something, but I guess that was what I hoped, but you just never know. I think it's helped a lot of people who have lost a loved one in processing their grief. I also wrote it kind of because the character, as you mentioned, is a bit of a loner, and I really wanted to show that, if you like being alone, that's not such a bad thing. A kind of solitary lifestyle can be a fulfilling one, but if it's not fulfilling for you, there are steps you can take to kind of move yourself out of that. And I think a lot of people who relate to that character, who are very shy and socially awkward, have kind of found inspiration in that, which has been really rewarding as well. But just I think the conversations that it started, I think it's a book that, for a lot of people, they have to have someone recommend it to them and assure them that it's not as depressing as it sounds. But then that opens a dialogue between those people in the same way I was able to open a dialogue with my loved ones. And I love that it's kind of having that effect. And I hope will contribute to the greater conversation that is happening around death, especially in places like Australia and the US.
No, it's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I'm really grateful for you writing this book. I did actually, after I read it on that plane, I gave it to my mum to read. Sorry, my dog is getting a bit
Oh no, I love
narky.
dogs.
He hasn't had his morning walk yet.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's not your fault. Yeah. So I did give it to her to read, and this was last year before the dementia thing, and it actually made her say, "Oh yeah, I'd like to have a death doula." So that's something as a family we can now, look into and explore as, she goes down this end of life path. So that's a good thing. So I'm grateful for that. Thank you.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. So before we wrap up today, we're in the Wellbeing Room, and I love to ask my guests about wellbeing. And so, what is one thing that has improved your own wellbeing and helps you get more out of life?
One thing. I mean, I'm very well-being focused, so I'm trying to think of.
You can always give your top three if you like.
Okay, let me see. Well, I'm a superstar sleeper, so I think, when I was younger, everybody thought I was such a grandma, but I feel like now the tide has changed and everybody goes to bed early. And I think I'm like, yes, this is my time to shine because I've been going to bed at 9 o'clock my whole life.
Yeah.
But I think that's really important to well-being. And movement. Just I do dance around the house, I do Pilates, I do tennis, I walk everywhere. So I always find that when I'm feeling sluggish or just in a bad mood, moving always helps. And music. I've always been musical, but I've been getting more into piano lately, and that has been I feel like it's very calming and healing and a good way to kind of transfer energy as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for sharing those top three well-being experiences that you have. I love that. Yeah, I love movement. I love music. I love dance. And my dog is probably going to bark in a moment. Thank you, Mikki, for joining us in the Wellbeing Room. It's been such a pleasure and a delight to have you here. I've loved your book. I've loved chatting with you, and I really want to encourage our viewers and our listeners to get a copy of The Collected Regrets of Clover and have a read. I think you won't regret it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being interested in the book and what I have to say, and for taking the time to chat to me. And apologies to your dog for taking his walk time from
That's
him.
okay. Awesome. Thank you so much.